know who Douglas Roche is. He has been a parliamentarian and a writer, and has been a long advocate of peace and disarmament in Canada. And we're delighted to have him this evening to give this presentation on hope in the era of Trump. And I'll just pass the microphone now over to Douglas Roche.
Well, thank you, Richard, and good evening to everyone. I send you all in Science for Peace my respect and my greetings. I'm a little intimidated when I come before such a distinguished group, but I'll do my best. To tell you the truth, I was never very good in school in the hard sciences. I managed to scrape through physics and chemistry only with the help of a partner. He was actually in the class I was in Ottawa. He was a French Canadian, and his writing abilities in English weren't so good, and mine were good. But he was a whiz in science, so he would do in the lab. He would do all the experiments and tell me what to write. He said, "Write this and write that." So I'd write it beautifully, and that's how I got through my science courses in school. So I have great respect for scientists, and of course I have a special admiration in my life for Joe Rotblat, the great scientist who left the Manhattan Project before the use of the atomic bomb the first time on moral grounds. And as a matter of fact, I have it by study where I'm speaking to you from in Edmonton tonight. I don't know whether you can see it, a portrait of Joe Rotblat that I treasure. It was painted by the Nova Scotia artist Tom Forrestal. And the last time I remember seeing Joe was in 2003 when he came to Halifax and the Thinkers Lodge in Pugwash, where he spoke, and he gave a sweeping presentation. I said to him earlier in the early stages of my career, I said that he was trying to get me interested in nuclear disarmament, and I said to him, "Joe, I don't know enough about the subject." And he said, "Never mind, Doug." He said, "You're going to learn." Well, I did learn from Joe Rotblat, and my life went on. And so here we are tonight talking about hope, and your presence tonight signals your desire and perhaps your search for sources of hope in today's chaotic world in which old alliances have been smashed, regional wars prolonged, human suffering worsened, and even our beloved and peaceful Canada challenged by a predatory American president. We have not seen such turmoil since the Second World War ended 80 years ago. And so we are asking ourselves, I ask myself all the time, how can we cope in this maelstrom that we're in today? The global threats to human security, climate change, nuclear weapons, genocides, starving peoples, all this existed before Donald Trump arrived on the political scene. But Trump, through his magnetic arrogance, has exacerbated the human security problems. He has multiplied old problems and created new ones by attacking legal systems in the US and beyond. Our heads are spinning, trying to keep up with this barrage of madness. We need to make sense of it all. We need to find hope that the world can be straightened out, that law can once again be respected, and that here at home, Canada can sweep aside the challenges to our sovereignty. In this maelstrom, I have dared to write a chapter, Hope in the Era of Trump, for the revised edition of my book, Keep Hope Alive, Essays for a War-Free World. That's what it looks like. So I ask where can we find hope in this new world dominated by President Trump? Well, first of all, I have to say that this is not a matter of my presenting to you with a glass of hope, as if hope were some sort of comfort food, and nor do I presume or pretend to have all the answers to the mysteries of the origins of hope. I can only tell you how I find hope in my own life, a long one to be sure, by holding on to a vision of a world in which law and order is respected, all people have access to the goods of life, and the planet itself is protected from devastation. That is not a dream. It's the essence of the Charter of the United Nations, the central document of the modern world. You can see that I take a political, that is, a human route to hope. It's often said that hope is not a strategy to bring peace to the world. That may be so. But hope is an attitude towards such a strategy. Hope consists of recognizing that the world is struggling to move on from the old culture of war that dominated the 20th century to a new culture of peace that has been defined but not yet achieved. We are literally transforming a world where life was once brutish, nasty, and short to a life where the benefits of science, medicine, industry, agriculture, communications, and travel are felt by growing millions of people. This is the basis of a culture of peace. A culture of peace is centered on nonviolence and reconciliation, and these are human, that is, political accomplishments. Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, Gorbachev. These are just some of the heroic political figures who paved the way and devoted their lives to building a culture of peace. In humanity's long journey from a culture of war to a culture of peace, we are presently passing through a dark valley. Trump, the disruptor, dominates the daily news, and we reel from each newscast. But we cannot live our lives by the hourly news. We must live beyond Trump. We must stand back and look out to the horizon and hold on dearly to the anchors of life. Hope is a theological virtue, and for some, a faith in God's divine mercy will see them through. But hope is not dependent on spirituality. It also comes from our intellectual recognition that in a world of globalization, we can only achieve safety and security through a political process that builds on common security. I have always believed that President John F. Kennedy was right when he said, "Here on earth, God's work must truly be our own." We are not alone. We are together in one world. When we discover that, it becomes empowering. And reaching out to connect with one another releases the hope that lies buried in our hearts. Trump, no matter how authoritarian he becomes, cannot extinguish this. Nor can he block the consciences of those who aspire to a political agenda built on social justice principles. What does this mean in practice? It means that in economic and social development, we actively support the Sustainable Development Goals, which aim for the eradication of extreme poverty and inequality. In global warming, we produce policies to effectively reduce carbon emissions and drive investment in sustainable energy to prevent catastrophic climate consequences. In arms control, we call for the phased elimination of nuclear weapons under strict international control and for Canada to sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. In human rights, we demand the protection of the peoples of Ukraine and Gaza and other war-torn places, and that they be given their human rights under international law. At the UN Summit of the Future a few months ago, nations signed on to a document called the Pact for the Future, which charts, as they call it, a path to a brighter future for all humanity. It includes a pledge to move faster towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement commitments on climate change. The document calls for addressing the root causes of conflict and accelerating commitments on human rights, including women's rights. The Pact for the Future brings into sharp focus the need for a recommitment to international cooperation based on respect for international law. But these positive steps towards peace are being torn apart by the remilitarization of key countries that still put their faith and money into expanded armaments rather than robust diplomacy. The answer to the problems of international security today is not more arms. The answer lies in a robust application of common security. That is, a security in which no one is safe unless all are safe. It is hard to stand up against a torrent of militarism today, but it must be done. Canada, which has made great contributions to peace in the past through putting resources into peacekeeping, the Landmines Treaty, the International Criminal Court, and the responsibility to protect, needs to recover its sense of purpose in the world. That purpose is not served by more arms, but rather diplomatic initiatives to foster peace rather than more war. Yes, it takes courage to stand up for peace today, but in so standing up, we keep alive and strengthen the hope within us. Let it not be said that the agenda for peace that I've outlined is too much. It is the minimum to assure human security for all. It is the core of the UN Charter, which sets out the process to maintain international peace and security through cooperation. The agenda for peace is the agenda for hope. I've long ago recognized that the agenda will not be fully achieved in my lifetime. That doesn't matter. What matters is that I am fulfilling my responsibilities as a human being to work for common security and build a culture of peace. When I do this work, I'm energized. I feel hope. I feel strength to stand up against the authoritarian Donald Trump. Trump is a passing figure. Hope lives on. Along with the United Nations, I have a vision of a better, safer, and more just world, and this guides me. Hope is unleashed within me. I'm strengthened. I'm an old man, but as long as I breathe, I will not stop. Hope is how I survive.
Well, thank you very much, Douglas, for these very inspiring words. And I'd like now to go to Emily Hannon for her first question.
Thank you very much, Richard, for the introduction. And thank you to you, Mr. Roche, for your very inspiring presentation there. I have, to be honest with you, a number of questions that I could ask throughout, but I'll start with one, just based on your personal experience, given your extensive background, not only with the United Nations, but then in Canada's Parliament as well. You kind of just answered it a little bit in terms of how you maybe navigate the difficulties of maintaining hope and feeling fulfilled and satisfied in that journey. And I just wonder, what have maybe been some of the moments that have challenged your capacity to hope the most? And how did you maybe navigate those difficulties? And maybe as well, or alternatively, are there moments that stick out to you as key points where hope was really able to flourish or was ignited for you in your different endeavors?
Well, thank you so much for such an interesting question, and I just take this. I see you're a young person, and I used to teach people just at your age. But as a matter of fact, of all the things I've done in my life, I was in Parliament, I was at the United Nations as an ambassador, and I was a senator. And of all the things I've done in my life, I like teaching at the University of Alberta, where I taught for 13 years as a visiting professor. I taught a course called War or Peace in the 20th Century. With a question mark. And I always told my students that pay attention to the question mark. And I would like, since I'm looking at your picture now, I would like to say one more thing directly to you. I used to tell the students, I am here to prepare a future Prime Minister of Canada. And I looked directly at the women in the class when I said that, when I made that statement. So never underestimate where your life might take you. I certainly never realized where my life was going to take me when I was your age. So you have to be open for possibilities and opportunities and so on. So in my background, I would say that a turning point in my life was when I went to Hiroshima and Nagasaki for the first time. I have the privilege of telling you now that I have been made an honorary citizen of Hiroshima by Tadakiba, then the mayor. This is in 2010, then the mayor of Hiroshima. I've been to Hiroshima several times in my life, and when I went the first time in the mid-1970s, I went as a young parliamentarian, and I had started to work on development issues, and I was going through Asia on research for a book I was writing on development, but I decided to go to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And when I saw there for the first time the museums with the artifacts, the terrible burning and the suffering, and I interviewed the Hibakusha, the people who survived the atomic explosion who were called Hibakusha. I interviewed them and began to study exactly what happened in this terrible ball of fire and flame that engulfed both cities. And I found out, like, I couldn't stand it, that it was that humanity, that humans could descend to such a level of destruction and inflict such punishment and terror and death on others. So that got me into nuclear disarmament, and I guess you would say I specialized in it, and when I got into disarmament with nuclear weapons, and with also considering the development needs for the poorest areas of the world, I began to see the relationship between disarmament and development. So you've asked me for what was an important moment, turning point, and I would say, in answer to that question, it was probably in 1987 when the United Nations held an international conference on the relationship between disarmament and development. And I led the Canadian delegation as an ambassador. I led the Canadian delegation in that conference and dealt closely with my friend Mujkan Dubai, the diplomat from India, who was the chairperson of the conference. And this whole theme was that security, human security, would be enhanced and developed by the following. Is you sort of see a triangular relationship between disarmament, development, and security. That is to say, the more you do on disarmament, which entails less money going into arms and more money going into development of human beings through education, health, water systems, everything that goes into development, the stronger security as a base for peace in the world becomes. And so there is a relationship. It's very hard to sell that today to when we're in a period of renewed militarism. As I said in my opening comments, we're living now in a time of revitalized militarism in which I mean, can you believe that even today, the Secretary of State of the United States, Marco Rubio, got up somewhere and said 2% of GDP for military spending for NATO countries is not enough. He's now calling for, on behalf of the government of the United States, the Secretary of State, Mr. Rubio, is calling for 5% of GDP to be spent on in NATO commitments. Well, this matter of the Sustainable Development Goals and the need to put our resources into the alleviation of poverty is being challenged and damaged terribly by this renewed drive for militarism as the answer to the problems of the world today. So you might say that's sort of a low moment for me in my career that I'm experiencing right now. When I talked about hope in my opening comments, but I don't want to mislead anybody here that I'm living in sort of hope. Hope you understand that when I talk about hope, I'm not talking about optimism. I'm not talking about feeling good or anything like that. I'm talking about an intellectual understanding of where our world is going and how we can move forward to a more human, just world. And to get that, we got to have disarmament, as the United Nations once strongly advocated for, and we got to have disarmament and more money than going into human development needs. That's the essential relationship and basis for peace, and my life has been built around those themes.
Wow, thank you very much. That was a great response.
Hey, Melissa, would you please unmute Robin Collins?
Hi.
Hey, Rob.
Thanks, Doug, for a very inspiring talk. You've seen decades of governments come and go, and leaders, federal leaders in particular, and not to mention global leaders, come and go. To what extent do the quality of those leaders matter in terms of moving us in those common security directions that you were talking about? And do you see some promise now? You don't have to name names, but you can if you want. When we were heading into an election, I don't want you to be partisan on this, but um, um, two things. Do you see potential, and how important are these national leaders in giving us guidance?
Two answers to that, Robin. The first is that leaders are absolutely essential in formulation of policy and moving government policies forward. And secondly, as Margaret Mead used to say, only the critical mass of people is enough, and say 25% of the population is enough in any area to move policies. So that the mass movements in civil society are also important. So I don't want to say that it's only leadership at the top or it's only civil society. It's both, and it's a melding of both. But certainly on the core of your question about the quality of political leadership today, it's pretty shocking that given the enormity of the problems that we have in the world today, there's been nothing like this. I mean, I'm as I said, I'm an old man. I was alive during World War II. I remember it very well. I was 16 when the bombing of Hiroshima happened and World War II ended in 1945. So the quality of leaders is extremely important, and I would point first of all to Gandhi as a leader who certainly shaped my life, and I learned nonviolence from Gandhi, and I regard him as probably in this competition between for the greatest figure the Time magazine held for the greatest figure of the 20th century. It came down to Gandhi or Churchill, and I opted for Gandhi, although recognizing that Churchill was a great leader in winning World War II. It was Gandhi who gave us the basis of future life in nonviolence and how human beings are to treat one another. So the leadership of Gandhi there, the leadership of Nelson Mandela in South Africa, the leadership of Martin Luther King in civil rights, the leadership of Gorbachev. I knew Gorbachev, and I was when he was at the end of the Cold War, particularly when he got sort of responsible, I suppose you'd say, for the dissolution of the Soviet Union and into the Russian Federation, and Gorbachev was not able to survive the inability to produce enough bread in the stores for people, even though his ideas intellectually resounded well in the halls of the United Nations. I was in the United Nations the day in 1989, I think it was, when Gorbachev gave his great speech on renouncing the use of militarism in foreign policy. It was astounding that the Soviet leader would renounce militarism in foreign policy. And the delegates were stunned by it, and they gave him a 10-minute standing ovation. I was there for it. It was a marvelous moment. So I've used these examples to show that the leadership at the top is extremely important. The leaders have power of the microphone to begin with, and also they have power in governments to move policies. So you gotta have leaders, and the absence of leadership today across the board in meeting the severe challenges that we face in a world that is disrupted, in which the very charter of the United Nations is coming under attack, and the business and the basis for the maintenance of international law being submerged in waves of nationalism and retribution and all these things that are going on. So I'm making a big pitch here for stronger leadership. You've touched on the election. I'm not going to go into the Canadian election now, but I'm only making the point that we need desperately to have leaders who understand the integration of human security, the integrated nature in which the economic and social development and arms control and environmental and human rights, all these things merge into a basis for peace. So I conclude this answer, having made a pretty strong pitch for stronger leadership, by reminding us all that we are leaders too. We're leaders here in this program, in this meeting we're having tonight. Civil society is extremely important. I was in New York, and I was a part of the 1 million person march in New York in 1982, when we marched from Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza across the street from the United Nations to Central Park in New York. It was a thrilling moment. I'd like to go back to the first question of the young lady who asked me about one of my best moments. Well, that was certainly a high moment in 1982, when we felt the power the power of the people, that it was just it was palpable that to take part in that event, and it had a result. I mean, it got Reagan, President Ronald Reagan's attention, and a couple of years later, a few years later, he and Gorbachev, having come close in the Reykjavik meeting to agreeing to abolish nuclear weapons, at least went on, and they were pushed aside by their own retinues of people, officials who wouldn't have it. But they went on to sign the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which removed a whole category of nuclear weapons, the intermediate weapons, those between 500 and 1,500 kilometers. So the power of the people, and what does that mean? I don't want this answer to go on too long, because I know there are other people who want to maybe raise questions, but it means that, like we can't all be Secretary General of the United Nations, but we can, in our own lives, we can touch people. We can write to a member of Parliament. We can communicate, write to a letter to the editor. We can communicate. We can express our voice, the voice of the people. To use that voice to raise the level of discourse in our own community. And there's nobody here on this program tonight, who is exempt from the challenges and the possibilities that are in everyone's lives in modest ways. We fail too often in thinking that well, because I'm not an elected official, I can't do anything. And that's not true. Elected officials, true, as I've said, in getting up to the pinnacle of power, are extremely important, but so too are informed, educated, committed, and hopeful people.
Okay, well, now let's go to Ellen Woodsworth.
Hello, Doug. We met at the World Peace Forum in Vancouver a few years back.
Yes, I remember. Thank you very much.
We're honored to have you at that time. And I think we're at a time when people are rising up, and there's an opportunity for all Canadians to be speaking about the fact that the largest item on the federal budget is the defense part of the budget. And I think that in our Wanda Ottawa Peace Caravan we just had not long ago, we talked about, our slogans are demilitarize, decarbonize, decolonize, but that huge defense budget could be turned to peace and be used for social sustainability that Canadians are desperately calling for, whether it's affordable housing, healthcare, addressing the TRC and women issues, and education. And I'm wondering, I draw you back to the election because I think this is an opportunity for us to build the peace movement and talk about how Canadians can have an influence on exposing Canada's current role that could be turned into a peacekeeping role, and then at the same time meeting those pressing needs.
Well, I totally agree with you. Ellen. As a matter of fact, Ernie Bergier, peace advocate in Canada, and I has written a piece on that very theme. It's going to be in the Hill Times next week, in which we make the point that in this present election campaign, the Canadian political leaders are sidestepping the real issue of Canada's security by insisting that more military spending will guarantee our security. And we're making the point that arms have rarely, if ever, advanced durable peace, and we need instead a visionary and robust diplomacy. So the budget now running where Canada takes a big hit from the hard line right, who claiming that we're only spending 1.39% or something like that of our GDP on our defense spending. That neglects to point out that Canada is in volume terms is the 6th largest spender in all the NATO countries. And so the idea that we're negligent in our military spending is a myth, so they've all pretty well, to my chagrin, I've now observed that the 2% target that was sent out there a few years ago, the 2% of our GDP must be spent on defense, is now becoming sort of a common coin, as if it's like not debatable anymore, that we have to go, and the leaders in the present campaign have committed themselves to that by a certain period of time. And but as Ernie and I point out too, but it's never enough for the militarists. It's never enough. And as I said a few minutes ago, here's Rubio today saying we got to have 5%, but it's really outrageous, because what the money that just viewed in domestic terms, that's money that is not going to go into education and health and services for Canadians. They talk about this great housing crisis we're having, and of course we're all aware of the medical crisis, and not enough facilities, not enough medical teams, professional medical people to take care of us, and all this is as a result of misappropriation of spending, and the claim that we got to have more and more military spending to deal with the international problems of today is really dangerous, because it takes us down a path where the old adage, if you want peace, prepare for war, it's completely turned around, because if you want peace, you got to prepare for peace. You got to prepare for peace. You got to build the systems, build the United Nations systems. So the peace building processes, UN, the mediation techniques that have been used in various conflicts around potential conflicts around the world have produced results, but the UN takes a big hit, because they say, well, he can't stop the main wars. And it's true, it didn't stop the war in Ukraine, it didn't stop the war in Gaza, because political leaders involved in both situations have refused to accept that negotiations and diplomacy have to be the basis for not more military spending. So I agree with you, and I lament that in our own country of Canada, that it's now becoming acceptable to have 2%. And I hope that we'll get to a situation where be a better political understanding and better government policies that will recognize the integrated nature of human security, that it doesn't depend on militarism per se. It depends on the melding of development processes and diplomacy and the other tools that the United Nations provides through its many agencies. I mean, it's horrendous when you look at the figures. I used to show up when I was teaching. I had charts, and I'd show my students how much money is spent for military, and it's currently running about $2.4 trillion a year globally. Global figure on military, 2.4 trillion, and the global figure on the UN processes of peace. I mean, everything the United Nations does and associated things, running about 30 billion or 40 billion. In other words, about half of 1% of what is spent on military is spent on peace. I mean, it's outrageous, the disproportion of spending, and we allow this to happen. I mean, we allow this to happen because not enough of us getting up and protesting and saying this disparity is unacceptable, and that we got to learn. But as Barbara Tuchman, I conclude my answer by quoting Barbara Tuchman, one of my favorite historians, who wrote The March of Folly. And she said, The governments they're full of wooden-headedness. Wooden-headedness. What is wooden-headedness? She said it's the idea that you can keep on doing the same things over and over again, even though they've been proved not to work, but you still use them anyway. We've seen what militarism has done in the 20th century. 100 million people were killed in the 20th century as a result of wars, World War I, World War II, and yet we still and subsequent wars as we got into this century. We still have political systems that are dominated by hard right military industrial complex people. The systems, the defense industry, they buy and sell politicians in the United States, and we allow this to happen. And it's hard. But we got to maintain our voices to protest against the misuse of money that ought to go for development.
Well, thank you, Ellen, for your question. And now let's move to Anya Russell. Yeah. Melissa, Anya is still muted.
I've been unmuting her. I'm not sure what's going on there.
Oh,
So,
hi there. Hi, nice to meet you guys. My question is, you mentioned earlier that civil society has a huge role to play, but I've noticed increasingly that there may be like a lack of education, especially amongst like younger people on like these larger world issues. So, for example, how would you say we can mobilize when there is a time of such political polarization and polarization of um, ideas, especially coming from social media and echo chambers and that kind of social divide that we're experiencing?
Well, thank you. I think I understand your question, and I think I probably will not be able to give you a satisfactory answer to a question that speaks to how we can, exert ourselves in a way that is effective. I don't myself follow social media, like hour by hour. So I mean, I have some, of course, and I have a Twitter account and so on. But I am not myself as susceptible as perhaps you and your peers are to social media that has perhaps a deleterious effect on getting at truthful examination of issues and not presenting distortions. But I come back to the idea that there are many organizations here in Canada. I mean, Project Plowshares would be one such organization that invites people to join them in studying issues and carrying out projects and on the issues of disarmament and development, and increasingly now in the climate change issues. So for quite a long time, the United Nations fostered youth programs and programs for disarmament education, in which courses were available, and I think they still are, courses to help young people to understand issues, to learn and to understand, and to figure out how they can apply that knowledge. So I think that wherever you go to school or wherever. I mean, I understand well the education systems under severe financial constraint that they cut back on courses. They're not judged to be job producing courses, and I understand that very well, and I lament it. But I think that for young people, and I sense it in yourself as I listen to your question, that you're searching for ways to manifest the thinking that you have and relate it to other people. Well, through joining an organization, the Pugwash movement, the student Pugwash, the Pugwash, the Science for Peace, right there, our very hosts tonight. There are groups everywhere. Civil society has many tentacles, and I think you have to reach out and not content yourself by saying, "Well, it's none of my friends are none of my friends seem to be interested in this subject, so I'll just drift off." Well, but to that I would say, get yourself a new set of friends, because there are lots of people in civil society organizations. I know I've talked to them. I've given lectures and so on. I mean, I'm aware that there is. Sometimes you have to search it out, but there is a good number of outlets for all of us, and particularly for young people. I'm very big on young people recognizing that it's not the future that they have to be concerned with, but it's the present. The present is the future.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Anya, thanks for your question. Now let's move to Moji Aga.
Oh, hi. It was difficult to unmute. Anya's question spoke to my heart. I am an Iranian American peace and human rights and climate change and democracy and civility activist. And I've been working for decades before Anya was born with the endorsement of Noam Chomsky to try to defragment the civil society. I fully agree with you, Douglas, that the civil society has many tentacles. However, those tentacles are acting in silos. And we have a systemic fragmentation of the civil society, which is why people feel not empowered enough to be able to resist the militarization of culture, not just finances. And so in order to do that, we need to have the same thing, not the same thing, but a similar formation to chambers of commerce that organize, huge corporations and small businesses for a fig leaf. But we in the civil society do not have intersectional circles or chambers of compassion so that we can defrag. Some of the ones who are younger may know what defragging a hard drive is. We need to defrag the civil society. And this, I sent the link in the chat. And yesterday, actually, we were talking about, in another Zoom, about a course called Intersectional Activism in order to make, to create an academic course, make it academically, recognized that young people, when they do participate in civil society intersectional in different realms, in different causes, they learn a lot. So as a retired university educator and a retired psychologist, I am thinking about how to make, intersectional activism, to get it established at a university somewhere, so that we can say, when a young person or young people, especially in their formative years in college, when they participate in civil society organizing, that they are learning a lot of things, including some life lessons, and that needs to be recognized academically. So anyhow, sorry for talking too much and advertising shamelessly for what I'm doing, but I believe we really need to systemically collaborate across cause, so we have the critical mass that is needed in order for us to be able to, as a society, to resist, the horrors that are unfolding. Thank you for letting me speak.
Well, thank you. I found your comment fascinating, and I thoroughly agree with you. And I'd like to begin my answer by thanking you for citing Noam Chomsky, probably one of the greatest, or one of the great intellectual figures in the world today, who seems to be banned by the Western media, that they won't give him any space at all, and yet he's got more understanding of the integral nature of human security than virtually any other commentator. And I've just been reading his latest book called Towards a Livable World. And I loved your expression, intersectional activism. Of course, exerting ourselves in an understanding of the integrated nature of human security, how issues are interrelated. We're in a globalized world in which no one country can solve problems by itself, whether we're talking about nuclear weapons or the pandemic or economic and social development and so on. I mean, all these issues transcend borders and are a reflection of the world that we live in. And this allows me to make the comment here, just in passing, that I fervently believe that as a result of our increased knowledge, and of course, in Science for Peace, we well recognize the multiplying of knowledge every decade, and the doubling of our scientific knowledge. I firmly believe that humanity is on an ascending curve upward in the level of our humanity. That is to say, if you go back to the year 1000, life was pretty brutal and short. And in the year, and say the year 1900, it was primitive compared to what we have today. In other words, if you look at all the fields of our avenues of our life, whether you look at industry, commerce, medicine, science, technology, transportation, communications, all these things, more people in the world are getting more benefit from the products of life, the avenues of life, than ever before. Now, when you say that, you're risk being misunderstood, that you're bypassing the people who are suffering today. And so I well recognize the intense suffering. My heart goes out, and I bleed internally. I'm bleeding for the people of Gaza, the people of Ukraine, the people of Sudan, the people in Congo. I mean, the suffering is intense, but we must recognize that the world as a whole, is moving forward, and we have discovered that there can be a culture of peace. And as a matter of fact, the United Nations should be given credit for this. The United Nations produced in 2016 they adopted a document called the right to peace, the right to peace built on a culture of peace. The culture of peace was itself adopted in the year 2000, and it was a set of measures revolving around nonviolence. One of my great friends, Ambassador Chowdhury from Bangladesh, was the driving force to get it through the UN system in the year 2000, in which they set up the first decade of the 21st century, that is to say from 2001 to 2010, would be the decade for a culture of peace. And they started to have programs. There are many programs around the world of education, sports, entertainment, all kinds of programs that reflected were built on the ideas put out in the culture of peace document. But what happened, of course, was in 2001, September of 2001, 9/11 occurred, and the trauma of that event was the rebirth of militarism, and the world went down with the. Your comment has evoked a whole lot of things in my mind, and I'm trying to wrestle with getting them out in a coherent manner, because what happened as the Cold War ended, was the 1990s began. There was a golden moment there in the first part of the 1990s, when, as a matter of fact, the Security Council met at the presidential level for the first time, and the measures of cooperation and hope that were espoused at that time were remarkable. I was there. I was part of that scene. And I was affected by it. And of course, it went downhill when it got 9/11. We went down, and then the war militarism, the Iraq War, and so on. So the way in which we have moved the world from the old culture of war, which we fully, understand. We understand what happened. I mean, in wars, and therefore it gave birth to the ideas of a culture of peace. And so we start to move in that direction, but we're overtaken by events, 9/11 and the Iraq War and so on, so that the resurgence of militarism has dominated our politics ever since, and we're living in that now. I liked your expression, the chamber of compassion. If we had more compassion, it seems to be sort of a simple thing to be compassionate, and I suppose in any given situation, you have a starving child in our midst, well, we'll do something about it, because we'll act. The humanity in us comes out. But starving children in their masses, in their millions, I mean, it's sort of an abstraction, and therefore we do need to have a better understanding of how the compassion that is within us, as when we are born. We're not, when the baby exits the womb, that little creature is not a violent person. But if 20 years later that person becomes violent, is a violent person, it's because we're socialized to violence. So this manner of how we have intersectional activism in helping students, if we're professors, or helping our colleagues, or even participating, understanding that the integral nature of the problems that assail our security, whether there's arms or poverty or climate. I mean, all these things have to be met in a way that recognizes this now. And my final point on this is that you just lightly touched on democracy. And democracy is under great strain today, because we have not in our democracies fulfilled the promise of democracy, namely that a better life in freedom and capacity to develop oneself according to one's own abilities, is we've not fulfilled that, and that, of course, is one of the reasons for Trumpism, and that Trump himself has cashed in on. So we got to, I don't know, it's a huge issue, but it begins with each one of us recognizing that we're not adrift in a jungle at midnight without a compass. We do have a compass. It's called the Charter of the United Nations. And in it there, we do have the basis for fulfilling the destiny and the hopes and the aspirations of humanity, and that we can find our way. None of this is to say that it's all going to be easy to fall into place. I mean, it's a process. We're all in a process. You don't have the answers to it all. I don't have the answers to it all. We are discovering, we are moving, but we are elevating humanity as we move.
Okay, thank you, Moji. Now we'll move on to Patricia Phillip.
Thank you. First off, Mr. Roche, I have a great deal of respect for you. I really appreciate and read your articles in the Hill Times. Tonight's talk is a reignitement or reignition of my hopes for a better world. And I just wanted to ask you about 20 years ago, Saul Arbus from the Victoria branch started a movement called Citizens for Peace, and talking about setting up a Department of Peace in the Canadian government. I represented the World Federalist Movement at the Montreal branch, where we met with many other organizations, NGOs, looking for such an initiative for a Department of Peace. We actually got a fair way along in the process, but never really became concrete. And I wondered, is there still hope that the Canadian government could institute some kind of Department of Peace, maybe under a subsection of another department? But I really think we need to be focusing more and more here in Canada on the options of the working against militarization and looking more towards developing a program for our youth to look at Department of Peace and all kinds of activities in which they can participate. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that observation about how we do need Citizens for Peace, and we need a government department on that. My mind goes back to the 1980s, which I think was probably the most fruitful period when the government had a group called a consultative group on disarmament, which was citizens, mixed range of citizens from around the country who would come and over 1 or 2 day, usually 2 day meetings that the government paid for to bring people in from around Canada to examine the issues of arms control and the related issues of economic and social development, with a view to making recommendations for policy. And also the government funded the Centers for Peace, which they stopped funding as time went on. So it's not as if that the government never did anything like this, but it was involved in sponsoring educational programs involving citizens. That diminished as time went on, and as we get into the 21st century, it faded away, and the ideas of citizen participation met with resistance by the ascendancy of right-wing elements in the government that did not want to have their ideas of dominance, security dominance through militarism, interfered with by people who would be championing other causes. So you mentioned the World Federalists, and this gives me an opportunity here to pay my own compliments to the World Federalists in Canada and the work of Fergus Watt and his colleagues and other people too. I have a great admiration for them, for their work in groundwork, I would say, in delineating how parliaments can be involved in a common effort. Well, we do have parliamentarians, for example, in inter-parliamentary union that come together and work on issues, but it's sort of on an ad hoc basis. I mean, it's not really a wing of the government. Whereas the idea of a parliamentary assembly would be composed of people who are elected and work together in a global parliamentary assembly. We're not there yet in the development of humanity. As I said earlier, I repeat, humanity is ascending, but we're not at the point where we are willing to recognize the enforceability of world law, or the need for having a one world government. If all the problems are global and there's one world and you should have one government, well, that's a very, very controversial idea. I mean, because who would actually run the government? But nonetheless, the movement of citizens participating at a higher level, whether in parliaments or as NGOs, is taking place, but it meets with a great amount of resistance from governments themselves, and we need to maybe again make our views known in a more coherent and steady manner to get support. I mean, it just I'm associated with people who go and visit parliamentarians every so often to try to get them to focus on issues, and they all have the same experience. It's very difficult. There's a handful of parliamentarians. There's 350 or 325, whatever, parliamentarians in Canada, but it's only a handful of that number that are cognizant of the issues that we're talking about tonight. And not that they don't care, I would say so much. Some of them don't, but I mean, perhaps a lot of them do care, but they're overwhelmed. They got so many issues that are going on, and they're running all the time. So they need help in finding priorities for disarmament issues, for example, supporting the treaty of the prohibition of nuclear weapons. It's a new treaty, came in 2017. But a lot of parliamentarians don't understand it. They don't understand the difference between the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons and the non-proliferation treaty. They don't understand the difference between the two, and they don't push, and so they don't push the governments, and so we try to push them, but it's a handful. So all this would be greatly enhanced were there a Citizens for Peace, a wing of the government, or a department, an area that occupies space in the public square, occupies not just on an ad hoc basis, but on an organized, funded basis. Well, that seems to be a goal too far. I don't want to speak lightly of it. I mean, that it can't be attained. Perhaps it can be, but we're not there yet. And as one who's been in and out of government and parliaments for most of my life, I say very clearly that it's important for people to contact, to be in association with their elected representatives, to inform them and to help to guide them, because the best ones want that kind of guidance. And the government itself seems oblivious to its responsibilities to help to educate people. And as a result of the lack of educated people, we get policies that are themselves unhelpful, if not disastrous, toward common security. So I conclude this answer, as I conclude a lot of my answers, by saying, look at we're in a struggle. We're in a struggle. We have to stay strong within us and find ways, be creative ourselves in whatever our domain of life is, by reaching out to for a partnership, for a collaboration, an association that is itself strengthening ourselves. And believe me, this is not bromides that I'm giving you here tonight. This is actuality, that we are strengthened as we associate with others of like mind to try to bring enlightenment into a stronger view of the integrated nature of security and safety today to others. And in doing that, we ourselves then become citizens for peace.
Thank you. Well, let's go now to Faria Khan, who hasn't yet asked a question. Faria. Do you unmute yourself?
Can you hear me, Richard?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Evening, Douglas. Thank you for your inspiring words and taking out the time to talk to us all today. I'm also privileged to be a Blumenfeld Junior Fellow this year, and also privileged to serve on the board of directors of Amnesty International Canada. It seems it's easier to talk about peace as a concept and slightly more challenging or seemingly less appetizing to talk about justice. And I worry sometimes we tend to talk about the two as mutually exclusive concepts, but one could argue that true and lasting peace cannot be achieved without addressing the underlying issues of injustice, ensuring accountability for wrongdoing, and holding those perpetrators accountable. We are living in interesting times, as you suggested at the start of your call. Those who want to hold perpetrators accountable, even in a democratic country like Canada, where freedom of speech is a constitutional right, are silenced or have to succumb to self-censorship. It is quite disheartening. Under the Trump administration, pro-Palestinian protesters, human rights advocates, or anti-genocide protests are ironically seen as the perpetrators. Mahmoud Khalil, a student activist and lead negotiator for the encampment in the 2024 Columbia University pro-Palestinian campus occupations, was taken from his New York City apartment building by US Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents on March 8, 2025. Ozturk was enrolled in a PhD program at Tufts University on a valid F1 visa, which allows international students to pursue full-time academic studies. She had about 10 months left to complete her doctorate. Her visa was revoked. She was taken from the street by ICE agents. What was her crime? She wrote an op-ed in the school's newspaper in which she criticized Tufts' response to a student government group's call for the university to divest from companies with ties to Israel because of the conflict in Gaza. Palestinian activists are worried that the same thing is going to happen here in Canada once the government changes, and quite frankly, it's already begun. Palestinian activists' house are raided here as well. So how can we have true peace when those who pursue true justice are silenced, discriminated, and disadvantaged?
Thank you. I begin my answer by saying immediately that the Palestinian, the rights of Palestinians need to be recognized and respected, and the wrongs that have been committed against Palestinian people have been is outrageous, Now, I need to separate your question, though, because the examples you used principally were in the United States, which is going through an aberration right now with the Trump retribution, whatever excuse they use in the United States to stifle and shut down opinion that is not in harmony with the government. What they're doing in deportations and shutting down of speech at the universities, the cutting of grants, public money going to universities where the protesters and demonstrations have taken place in a lawful manner, is outrageous and completely unacceptable. But that is a matter that the United States itself is going to have to the people of the United States themselves are going to have to deal with. The second part of your question dealt with Canada. I would hope that that we do not get to a situation in Canada where student protests of speech, responsible, free, non-violent activity by students is not tolerated in Canada. I mean, let me put it positively, turn that around. We should have the students and young people and anybody should have and exercise the right in Canada to speak for peace with justice. Perhaps I was negligent earlier in my comments this evening when I talked about peace by not linking it as you did immediately with justice, because when I talk about peace, I include justice. I mean, there cannot be any peace without justice. Social justice, justice in the whole question of the spending of armaments and development, as I've said. We have to integrate human rights in their fullest dimensions into our policies that are dealing with the specifics, whether it's arms control, economic and social development, in other words, the exercise of democracy and building the conditions of life for people. So here, this gives me an opportunity to say what we can do here in Canada is to assert our belief that the two international bodies on justice need to be strengthened, the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, and that they need to be strengthened in their jurisdiction, their ability to exercise their authority and jurisdiction, and strengthened in terms of resources that they employ. So this is let's call it like a project that might come out of tonight, that we find ways to ensure that free speech, criticism of governments, criticism of wrongs, criticism of the social injustice to people that is exercised today, was particularly seen in the Palestinian question, but it's also seen in the questions of Bangladesh. And so, and I'm just reading today, I don't want to detour from the question too much, but I mean, talk about injustice, the tariff question, Trump's tariff questions leveled against, of all countries, Bangladesh. Bangladesh, a country I know well. I wrote a book on the place, in which the garment industry is their main source of income, and the tariffs on garments coming from Bangladesh to the United States now is going to close down garment industries in Bangladesh, which will result in thousands, untold numbers of people, workers, and in many cases women workers who are going to be laid off, fired because of the tariffs. I mean, that's injustice. So injustice comes in many cloaks. In many cloaks. It's but I don't want to veer too far away from your question about the protection of the people of Gaza, the protection of the Palestinians, right? The rights of Palestine to a state. I've called this for years, that the the state of Palestine be recognized, just as the state of Israel is recognized, and a two-state solution. I mean, we say we've gone too far. We can't have a two-state solution. I don't agree with that at all. I believe that there should be much more pressure exerted on the format and the formula for a two-state solution. So I think I'll end my question there, unless you want to have a supplementary. But I mean, I understand your question, and I support what you're saying.
Well, thank you. We only have time for one more brief question from Anya.
Hi, this is actually Serene. I was having some technical difficulties, but my question actually connects to the previous one regarding Trump's administration specifically, and how his active disengagement from the multilateral institutions like the United Nations or international efforts like the TPNW. How does this alter your view on international cooperation as like a feasible and credible path to peace? And do you believe that global trust in diplomacy can be rebuilt after such a long period of isolationism? Or do you think there's been like a moral shift within the international community?
Well, that is really interesting. Has there been a moral shift that relegates trust to the dark corners of our life? I mean, there are so many ways to approach this question. I'd like to begin by what you mentioned yourself, the United Nations. The United Nations is given a bad rap today. Because it can't stop wars and so on. But the critics of the UN fail to recognize that there's not a person on the planet who is not affected one way or another by the wide range of UN programs, whether in health and education and meteorology and transportation and communications. I mean, there's a whole plethora of ways in which the UN helps to develop the human condition. Global trust. You talked about global trust. Trust is broken today. There is no trust. When people like to say, well, it's all Trump's fault. I mean, I'm certainly not here to. I am not here to defend Trump, but I mean, it's more than Trump. The breakdown in the recognition and affirmation of international law started long before Trump came, and Trump in some ways is a reflection of our loss of regard for the tenets of the United Nations Charter and the building of the body of international law through the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court and other such bodies. Can we get trust back? Well, that's a very big question today, and I would be very rash indeed were I to make any kind of prediction that maybe in 20 years we might get it all back. We might not. The future is unknown. We can only live in the present and plan for stronger bonds of humanity. And in the various comments I've made tonight, I've shown how we all need to reach out, and we are strengthened in so doing. And that itself is a contribution to restoring trust in the world. The politicians have to respond to that by performing at a higher level to earn our trust. So I mean, it's not just there's no easy answer to the kind of question that you just asked about how we can build a world of re-engagement rather than disengagement in the world. And I like, there's no one piece of paper, or there's no one person, it's a whole bunch of things. But I would say we must bring back into the limelight, into the spotlight, the Charter of the United Nations. So that was written, that document is a core of how we live. in maintaining peace and security in the world, and peace, but I mean, again, social justice, peace with development guaranteed to people. People have a right to peace. They have a right to. I wrote a book called "The Human Right to Peace," that people have this right. The essence of their humanity, the oneness of the world, the globalization we're all living in. I mean, all of this is all tied together, and we need to not be overwhelmed by it, and I'll give you a simple solution. I've been turning off the CNN news at 6 o'clock at night. I mean, if we, I don't want to repeat myself too much here, but if we allow ourselves to be dominated by the discordancies of daily life, then we sort of fade away, and our determination to exercise our will to obtain justice, that's weakened. We don't want that. So we got to stay strong. We got to stay strong. And each person has to do it. Maybe I stay strong, maybe by going into aquafit class every Friday morning. I go to aquafit class and I work out there, and I make, it's just, it's a simple little thing, eh? But it helps me to get out of myself. Getting out of ourselves for the sake of something else, improving ourselves, that's the only way to live.
Well, Douglas, thanks so much for giving us the benefit of your wisdom gained over so many years of thinking about these issues. And you certainly had a very wide range of questions and issues to respond to in a very, very thoughtful manner. So it seems to me from the questions asked and your responses that everyone is more or less agreed on the goal, on the kind of world we want to create, one with human security and ecological survivability and human rights. And the issue is always is one of strategy, of how actually we make that world. We know what must be done, but the problem is that what must be done often isn't done. And so we have to figure out how it can be done. And that's the really hard part. So thank you very much for helping us struggle with that issue. And I don't know whether it's appropriate on a webinar to clap, but I would like to. Since most of you are muted, it'll make no difference. But that's
Thank you.
a clap anyway.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you to all, and thank you for a very stimulating evening. Of the questions were terrific. So, thank you.
Okay, see you all maybe in about a month when we have our next webinar. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night.